I'm Tracy Gillespie. I'm the Historic Sites Manager with Nova Parks. Nova Parks has over 30 sites in the Northern Virginia region, and most of our sites are recreational, so you can ride on the W&OD trail, or you can put your boat in at Algonquian, or you can golf. You can rent a place for a wedding. You can come to a historic site like Aldie Mill. I have the honor of managing 5 sites along the Route 50 corridor. The first of which, when I started working 10 years ago, is here at Aldie Mill, our 1809 grist mill. And it's nice to have you all here. Appreciate the fact that you're taking some of your time with us today. Local legend has it that a certain young man by the name of Daniel Dangerfield had toiled here for a short time as a rented slave, and we're going to hear all about him today from a dear friend of mine, Deborah Lee. I've known Deborah for a long time, but I wanted to make sure that I introduced her correctly, so I emailed and asked her, to send me some information, and so I'll read what Deborah sent me. Dr. Deborah A. Lee is an independent historian, consultant, and author of books, pamphlets, and articles on the history of the Middle Potomac region of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. She specializes in African American and women's history in that region, and the heart of her work is the anti-slavery movement across racial, gender, and religious boundaries. How many of you know Deborah already? There's a lot more to Deborah than that. You sent me this, I'm like, oh, come on, girl. So last night I was thinking about how to introduce Deborah, and I was counting the years, and I hate to say, well, I don't hate to say it, but I think we've known one another for over 25 years, which is amazing. That means we were only about 10 when we met, and time just goes by. But I was the director at the Loudoun Museum at the time, and I'd asked a current board member if she would continue to serve on the board, and she couldn't. But she said, I have a friend, let me recommend this lady. Her name is Deborah Lee. I think you'll like her, I think she'll be good. So Deborah came on the board of Loudoun Museum, and it's just marvelous for the museum, marvelous for me. We've become good friends. It turns out my husband Rich taught her son and daughter. We are tea buddies, get together for afternoon tea when we can, a couple of times a year. But she is extremely modest, I have to say. There's so much more to your resume than what you sent. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Deborah and her husband and family used to live in Percival, and they now are outside of Charlottesville, outside of Stannersville. And so she's come up today to do this especially for us, and it's just an honor to have you here. So Deborah is going to be speaking today about Daniel Dangerfield, and even more broadly than that, about the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activism. So without further ado, Dr. Deborah Lee.
Wonderful to be back in Loudoun County and among old friends and history friends. We've had so many great adventures together, and they continue. And appreciate the weather today, kind of perfect for doing something like this. So thank you for spending this time with me. And got lots to tell you, more I've learned as I've dove into this again. And glad for the opportunity to share this passion with you. So, Daniel Dangerfield, I first want to kind of touch on Underground Railroad scholarship. For a good while in academic circles, it was neglected, and there were so many stories about the Underground Railroad, some of which were true, others not so much. And Larry Guerra's book, The Liberty Line, he talked about how entirely too much emphasis was put on the white Quakers who helped people to freedom, and that much more should be put upon the freedom seekers themselves, that it was they who took the risk to leave he suspected that they went off on their own with very little assistance in the South, that it wasn't until they got to the North that they really had much help. And the kind of like a lot of books, it kind of had an over effect. And in academic circles, the Underground Railroad was kind of scoffed at. And but yet there were people like us in communities that knew of these stories, these places, these people. We had these bits of evidence. We knew there was a good story there, an important story for understanding our country and the way it evolves. And so people lobbied Congress to provide funding through the National Park Service to research and interpret these places and people and stories. And so they did pass and establish funding for the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom as part of the National Park Service. And through them, that really encouraged people to not just research their own locality, but to connect with others in other places. And in a way, it had the effect of recreating those Underground Railroad networks. And those of us here met so many people from Alexandria, DC, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, that we could put our pieces together. We had a conference once at Thomas Balch Library, and someone from Gettysburg had this letter, and she said, "Has anyone here heard of Yardley Taylor?" and we went, "Yardley Taylor!" like he was a rock star, which to us he was, because of his activism. And through that we could see how these connect. And of course it made the work fun and exciting, because when you found a new source, you could share it and learn more. And we really saw a bigger piece of the puzzle. And sites have been nominated for inclusion in the Network to Freedom program, such as the courthouse here in Loudoun County. So this undergirds, and I want to thank the many people who have contributed to this, and tell you a little more. Now, Wilbur Siebert at the turn to the 20th century did a lot of research, interviewing mostly white people about their community and their activism and collecting documents and sources. And he tried too to get information from the black community. He wasn't as successful with that, but he made maps that showed here in red the known Underground Railroad sites. And this is in Illinois. Cheryl LaRoche is an historical archaeologist, and she researched the black communities in Illinois, and it really fleshes out your map a whole lot better and shows the networks and how they collaborated with one another. And if you were escaping from slavery, you'd be much more comfortable going to someone who was also African American for assistance. But they did work closely together. And in Loudoun County, with the Black History Committee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library, after we did the room naming and the essence books, we thought, well, should we continue? If so, what should we do? And Mary Randolph, she said, there used to be so many small black communities in Loudoun County, and they're getting lost and forgotten. And so we researched it and found like 30. Now, most of these were really formed post-slavery, but they had their roots in the black community, enslaved and free, often before. But Loudoun County was dense with Quakers, with African Americans who did participate in this, and we have so many great stories with an amazing amount of information. But today we'll focus on just one. And French Simpson who at one time owned Daniel Dangerfield, lived south of Oatlands. It's in a Barclay development now. And this turned up as I was doing the research for it. I didn't have time to get it in here, but it's an old log dwelling. It wasn't a dwelling, we don't think. It didn't have any windows in it, but it was probably a building he saw there. But people were escaping from slavery as long as there was slavery. And this one ad for someone named William Jordan Augustus, known as Billy, went into Maryland, and actually relatives of George Carter helped him escape further after he was apprehended. It was thanks to them that he was released, and George Carter was furious. And he talked in a letter about the Quakers in the area, the aiders and abettors of people escaping, and how they triumphed at his shame. He really went on about that. So, you know, people knew about these freedom journeys, and like John W. Jones aspired to it, and kind of a center of the Underground Railroad, as well as anti-slavery sentiment in Loudoun County, was Lincoln, the Goose Creek Friends meeting, which covered a pretty wide area, and Oakdale School. Oh, and this is Hughesville, which was black and white, but that does show black farmstead there that you would see along the way if you were journeying through. Yardley Taylor lived there, and he was a mail carrier for Loudoun County, and also very involved in the anti-slavery meetings they had at the Oakdale School there, which had black and some black students as well as white students. And this broadside was written against him and about how he rides through Loudoun on his lusty horse, I think he called it, with a mail bag that he likened to Pandora's box because of the mail that was in it. And we have seen lots of references to different letters, and you know, we know that communication went on quite extensively. And he did have a case where someone named Harry that he helped, and he was brought before the courts in the 1820s. So this was continuing, and Samuel Janney figures into the Daniel Dangerfield case. You'll hear more about him later, but he wrote anti-slavery essays in the newspaper that were published, trying to convince slaveholders that it was in their interest economically and otherwise. And he traveled widely. He was a Quaker minister, and visited other meetings. Some of those meetings, you read the roster, the wedding list of witnesses, and it was like, oh man, that was an anti-slavery convention. And he had a girls' school for a good while at Springdale, and his wife, Elizabeth, was a wonderful manager in all that. He often traveled. She was in charge, and they employed quite a few African Americans to do the farming and all the meal preparation and the work of running the school and the grounds. And one woman who, Judy Gaskins, who lived with them, she said that Samuel Janney was a mighty fine man, but Elizabeth, that she was a precious woman, that she and her daughters helped her buy her children's freedom. She had managed to purchase her own, and when she was sick, Elizabeth nursed her like she was her own mother. And there was another man that there's Springdale, just south of the Quaker Meeting House. Nelson Gant, Quakers convinced his owner on his deathbed to emancipate all the enslaved people he owned, but his wife was still here by someone else, and he came and rescued her, was caught in a big court case, and he stayed in that area with the Nichols family, and they worked for a year. They arranged to purchase Maria, his wife's freedom, and he worked for Samuel Janney. There was also a man named Oscar Carey who worked for him, and decades after the Civil War, Janney's daughter-in-law, Eliza, she became Rawson after a second marriage, but she said that Oscar Carey freedom seekers would come to Oscar, and then he would go to his employer, Samuel Janney, and say that they arrived, and then Samuel would let Elizabeth know, and she'd make sure that a meal was prepared, and then they would stay in the barn until that night and then leave. They usually traveled at night in the South when it was still pretty dangerous. So these were some of the things that were sort of the background of the case, and I'll tell you more about Dangerfield and his story, but one thing that we haven't been able to tell definitively, and I'd like to get your help on this, one thing we don't know if he had assistance getting to the north. I think this shows that if he didn't, that it was available. And the other thing is, did he help people himself when he went to the north? And some of these are circumstantial, but I'm laying out the background to help you think about it. And of course, we don't have a picture of Daniel Dangerfield, but I love this image for him because this case became a kind of cause célèbre in both Pennsylvania and Virginia. And he did, according to some of the testimony, he was about 15 years old when he was a mill boy at Aldie, it says. It doesn't say Aldie Mill, but we've tried to find other mills and haven't, and it seems very likely that it was here. And it appears from the Loudoun testimony as if he escaped, they said, in 1854. And he went from here to Harrisburg, and and he did a variety of jobs there, but he was captured in, actually word came that he was there in Harrisburg, and this was 1859, so that's 5 years later. An abolition postmaster in Brown, they even said, which was Thomas Brown in Circleville, just south of Goose Creek, that there was a letter from him, about him, but somehow word got out that he was in Harrisburg. So French Simpson had died. His wife Elizabeth inherited the estate. It was her son-in-law, Gulick, J.H., I think, who wanted to find him. And he went to Harrisburg. He saw him, but hid because he didn't want Daniel to see him. And he went and got help, and he was working loading coal, and it was likely near the railroad because of the coal, and I think there was a mention of that. And so Gulick came back with other men, and they accosted him, and Gulick at one point yelled out that he was a burglar because there were so many people, kidnappings of free people of color, as well as slave catching and who was to say which was which. So a lot of times people would intervene, so that's why he said burglar. And they managed to capture him and take him to a commissioner. Now the Fugitive Slave Law had been passed as of 1850, which made everyone culpable for helping, and it paid the commissioner $5 if they released a person and $10 if they said that he or she was to go back into slavery. And so they took him for a hearing. Well, they would have in Harrisburg, but the commissioner, they had a sympathetic to slaveholder commissioner, but he had, they put pressure on him and he left, and they had no commissioner there, so they took him to Philadelphia. And I'll tell you more about that, but I want to pause to say that when he was in Harrisburg, Daniel Dangerfield lived, they said, for several years with the Rutherford family in Swatara Township and Loudoun County around Harrisburg, kind of to the south and east. And there were several members of that family, evidence strong, there's no question that they were involved in the Underground Railroad, and Dr. William Rutherford, foremost above them, and then president of the Anti-Slavery Society, he also had the house in town. Now, so to me, that's curious that he's living here, he's working in Harrisburg, and he married and had 2 children in Harrisburg that had tragically died of illness just before he was apprehended. But to me, working near the railroad and with the coal in the city and this long-time association with the Rutherford family as strong evidence. At a conference on the Underground Railroad, I met a man who was doing a lot of research on William Goodrich, who was a very prominent businessman in York, Pennsylvania. And he started out as a barber, but was quite an entrepreneur. And he had built the largest building in York at that time, and he developed this Reliance line of urban cars, train cars, freight cars that had false bottoms in them. And he there were 13 cars in all, and they served 20 different communities in Harrisburg. And I asked him, I told him about Daniel Dangerfield, and I said, would he have been, did those cars come through Harrisburg? Were they used there? Is there a chance, given this information? And he was, quite confident that there was some involvement, because the Underground Railroad, of course, started when people were walking, but it really, as railroads developed, they took full advantage of them. And by the 1850s, they were using them a lot. So there was probably some familiarity here. But to get back to Daniel Dangerfield, as he was apprehended and riding the train then to Philadelphia, his friends in Harrisburg wired Miller McKim in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Now, he was, William Still said he was second, barely a second to William Lloyd Garrison. He was so, and he said, William Still in Philadelphia said, as a helper and friend of the fleeing bondman in numberless instances, he never failed in the hour of need. whether on the Underground Railroad bound for Canada or before a United States commissioner trying a fugitive case, the slave had found no truer friend. McKim occupied a position of influence, labor, and usefulness, scarcely second to Mr. Garrison. So he got to Philadelphia as fast as he could. He was called next friend to Daniel Dangerfield in the court, and he advocated for him mightily that he have a good hearing, and they enlisted 4 attorneys to help him in this, and one of them was Edward Hopper, who was Lucretia Mott's son-in-law, and he was very close friends and associates with Lucretia Mott, and was considered a moderate. But one thing he and Lucretia disagreed on was he supported John Brown and his ideas later on, which Lucretia Mott never did. But he was also a correspondent with Samuel Janney. And as for some of the convention and strategy of the anti-slavery people in Pennsylvania, which was publishing an address to slaves advising them to run away, he said that's crazy. He said very few of the slaves can ever get to see it, and if they see it, they cannot read it. They generally require no prompting to run away when not restrained by family ties and local attachments, of which they had many. But they cannot escape without great risk of their lives, and such advice given to them by abolitionists will have no other effect than to cause them to be watched more closely, if possible. And Leonard Grimes, I bring him here. He was from Leesburg, a free black man, born free, and went to D.C. and had a successful Hackney carriage business, helped a woman named Patty and 6 children escape from south of Leesburg, the same area where Daniel Dangerfield was from. They made it to Canada, and his church in Boston, when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, he lost 2/3 of his congregation right away to Canada. Some came back, and of course it grew otherwise, but he was close associates of Miller and McKim, and just want to bring in some other associations. So in preparing for this talk, I wanted to find an image of the courthouse where this took place, and that took a lot of doing to figure out where it was held. And when I found out Independence Hall, but it wasn't in. Now this served as the seat of our national government between 1790 and 1800. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were inaugurated here, and it has these wings on it. That was Old Congress Hall, where Congress met, the representatives on the ground floor and Senate on the top, and this was Old City Hall. And in the 19th century, they were using it for a courthouse on the bottom floor, and then the town government on the top floor. But in looking closely at the documents, because they talked about it was at the courthouse, so I'd always imagine it in a courtroom, but it wasn't a court case, it was strictly a hearing, and usually a summary proceeding done in the commissioner's office. But the commissioner, from that first day, there were so many people, he said, we can't have it in my office. We're going to move to the grand jury room to Sunday. That was a Saturday when Dangerfield was captured, and Monday morning was when it would convene in the jury room. Well, in reading really closely, it appears that it was in the grand jury room was in the basement of this wing, and they even had the address for it. So I'm pretty sure that was it, and I wonder if the National Park Service has heard about this story. So this court case attracted a lot of attention, and the claimants, they wanted to have time to get people to testify that this man was Daniel Dangerfield. He was going by the name of Webster, but I've continued to use Dangerfield because there seems to really be little doubt of his identity later on. And so there, not only were there the people testifying on behalf of Dangerfield, but there were lots of anti-slavery activists, black and white, that came and were trying to get in, and some of the women in particular, that's something else that I really came to appreciate in preparing for this. There were a large number of women that were going there in the night, that were going there hours before to be in this room, in this place, and they had no right to be there, and the commissioner tried to remove them and the officers of the law, but they would not be moved. And there, and Dangerfield, there's a description, there sat the man in his old hat and red flannel shirt and ragged coat. And Benjamin Brewster represented the claimants, and it said the crowd surged along the streets and aisles and packed the room. Despite the hordes and the excitement boiling at a fearsome pace, a great many privileged ladies were smuggled in amid much damage to crinoline. Now that was a little condescending, but very picturesque, and they were tight. And I read some of the letters from Quakers that had been there, and one woman said that she was lifted off the floor at times trying to get into this room. It was absolutely packed. And as I said, they were unsuccessful in removing him. Here I even found a list of some of the people in that room. Mrs. Wright, wife of David Wright, Esquire of Auburn. Mrs. Longstreth, the commissioner's wife, or no, she was the aunt of the commissioner. Other ladies belonging to the family of Longstreth. Mrs. McKim, Miller's wife, Miss Davis, granddaughter of Mrs. Mott, Mrs. Anna Hallowell, the Hallowells, Robert E. Lee's teacher in Alexandria, Mrs. George Earl, he was one of the attorneys, his wife, Reverend Mr. Brew, Dr. Furness, Mrs. Nathaniel Randolph, Miss Peabody, sister-in-law of Horace LeMan, Miller McKim, Professor Cleveland, and CNC. And in the hall, they named some other prominent abolitionists and others, many African Americans too. They were in the halls outside. They broke windows so they could hear what was going on in this case. And Lucretia Mott, most notably, was there. And that's the room where they were. So it sounds like I'm dying to go there and see these places. But that appears, from as far as I can tell, where it was. And so they began hearing testimony. Well, here's Lucretia Mott. So she sat right next to Daniel Dangerfield, and she was described by various people as an angel of light. And William Furness, who was there, said, "As I looked upon her, I felt that Christ was there." And there was an old black man they told about later who might have been one testifying on, he said, if Mrs. Mott doesn't get a high place in heaven, then I don't want to go there. She, I think, displayed that high level of consciousness that just radiates. So the first day was hearing testimony from the claimants, and we had Francis Luckett, a Philadelphia physician who was originally from Loudoun, who said he treated Dangerfield for typhoid and saw him many times afterward. John W. Patton, a constable, farmhand, and slave catcher from Loudoun, reported that he had worked many times with Dangerfield prior to 1854. He did threshing, different kinds of farm work. William L. Bogue, keeper of the Eagle Hotel, who was in Philadelphia in business, reported he'd known Dangerfield at age 15 as a mill boy at Aldie and recognized the scar on his cheek. Some people mention that. Sanford P. Rogers, Elizabeth Simpson's attorney, both said they knew Dangerfield from childhood. The final witness was James Gulick, son-in-law of Elizabeth Simpson, and who wouldn't swear. He was Baptist and wouldn't swear, but they took his testimony. The hearing was continued then until 4 p.m. Tuesday, and the crowds lingered around the building, hoping for a glimpse of the defendant. But during the day, a number of arrests had been made. They call them extra turbulence, people who were pro-slavery reporters, supporters who were agitating, and they released them later on. So that's when a lot of the women, stayed there and or came back and were there for 8 hours, and they were. That was very important to me. And what happened was they realized that, Miller McKim and Edward Hopper made the case that Daniel Dangerfield needed to present evidence that he was free, that he was not this man they said he was. And so they got word to Harrisburg, to African Americans there who would normally not be able to testify in such a case. But they came on the early train to Philadelphia, and they had to work to get everybody in the room that needed to be there. And they testified. The first was 66-year-old William M. Jones, a physician and Methodist preacher who said he met Daniel when he first arrived in Harrisburg in March or April of 1853. He'd helped him dig the cellar of his house, which was completed in 1854, and boarded with them during that time. His son, Henry M. Jones, reported he had also met him then, although not sure spring or fall. James H. Smith, who worked at a law bookstore in Philadelphia, recalled that he first met and befriended the defendant in 1848 at a Masonic meeting in Baltimore, Maryland, where he belonged to himself. And James F. Francis moved to Harrisburg in 1853 and said that he met Daniel at a party at the Jones home. And then an 88-year-old George W. Hall, who made it on that train to Philadelphia, said he saw him many times at evening parties and at the Methodist church where Jones preached. And at one point, Marshall Yost said, why don't you, the supporters of Dangerfield, why don't you just purchase his freedom? And at that point, Lucretia Mott put her arms around Daniel Dangerfield and she said, I'd give $100 to rescue him, but not a penny to purchase him. Mm-hmm. Wow. And so the hearing then continued, and let's see, that was on Tuesday. Okay, so then the decision says while the decision, and this is someone who was there, said, while the decision was being delivered, the courtroom presented one of the strangest scenes we ever beheld. There was not an inch of standing room, and the silence was so intense that even a sigh might have been heard. Then the women started crying as the commissioner talked, about his identity, and but then the commissioner said in a calm, pleasant way, "The prisoner is discharged." And at that point, people erupted into applause and rejoicing. And there was, they said there was this weak old woman with a very strong voice who went to the window and said, "He's free, he's free, give 3 cheers." And so the crowd outside started, cheering and applauding, and Dangerfield was carried out of the room above the crowd and out to the front, except for one account I read that said that this group of young Quaker men actually surrounded him and took him out the back way, while a look-alike was the one who went out front above. I'm not sure, which is correct, but they put him into a carriage and unhooked the team of horses and had a long rope. Now this was done in other places too, but in Harrisburg it had been done for this famous ballerina, Fanny Ellsler, who had come from Paris to Harrisburg and had taken the city by storm. Everybody went really wild for her, and they had one of these grand processions for her, the carriage was pulled by young dandies. But this time it was the black citizens of Harrisburg who then did this grand procession through the streets, and they would stop at like the houses of the attorneys or the commissioner and to give cheers, or in one case a serenade. And it went on into the wee hours of the night. But then they thought, for his safety, that Daniel Dangerfield should get out of town because of these extra turbulence and other people that would try to accost him. So, and they knew just how to do it. I'm certain they put him on the train, and as far as why he was released, Charlotte Fortin was a young black woman who lived there in Harrisburg, and she wrote in her journal about the alleged fugitive has been released. The commissioner said that he released him because he was not satisfied with his identity. Others are inclined to believe that the pressure of public sentiment, which was, strange to say, almost universally on the right side, was too overwhelming for the commissioner to resist, particularly as his own family, even his wife, it is sad, it is auntie too probably, declared that they would discard him if he sent the man into slavery. There's some other things too that Lucretia Mott had a role in that she talked to the commissioner before and said that she went up to him very quietly before the hearing was to start, and here, this is her words, Lucretia Mott. Knowing him as a birthright member of the Society of Friends, I ventured to step forward and, in an undertone, express to him the earnest hope that his conscience would not allow him to send this poor man into slavery. He received it civilly, but replied that he must be bound by his oath of office. This line of the poet came to my mind, which I simply repeated and said no more. But remember, the traitor to humanity is the traitor most accursed. So, needless to say, there was a lot of support for him. And as Daniel Dangerfield traveled up to Canada, he could have come in contact in Elmira, New York with John W. Jones, who was from that same part of Loudoun County as Daniel Dangerfield. He escaped about 10 years earlier and was a conductor of the Underground Railroad in Elmira, New York, and the trains from Philadelphia used to go to New York City until James W.C. Pennington, the fugitive blacksmith, his family, other family members were trying to escape and come join him, and they took the usual route through New York, but they were captured, and it sent shockwaves through the anti-slavery Underground Railroad community, and they shifted the line to Elmira, New York. John W. Jones communicated closely with William Still there, and also with a minister in Canada who had a church who supported refugees from slavery and helped them get established. So it's very likely that Daniel Dangerfield went through Elmira on his way. And the newspapers, meanwhile, this really did become a cause célèbre, a great controversy on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. The newspapers in Loudoun, they were incensed. This was the end of democracy. People weren't obeying the Fugitive Slave Law, and they were just incensed that he was set free. And then on the other side, of course, it was very anti-slavery, and you could see the tension really mounting, and would soon erupt in violence. But in Niagara Falls, the story isn't over yet because there was a man, Edward Hopper, who was one of the attorneys for Dangerfield, and his wife, along with another Quaker, Dolan Parrish, and his wife, had been to Canada on business and pleasure. They were stopping at Niagara Falls and enjoying the view when a black man named Amos Norris came up to him and said, "Excuse me, are you Samuel Janney?" And Dolan Parrish was, "How do you know Samuel Janney?" whom he knew well. And Amos Norris said, "Well, he used to live in Loudoun County. I think he said he came north about 1850, but this is an ad from 1827, so that probably wasn't his first escape from Loudoun County. But he was among the black community there, and there is a black and white community there. And so he said this led to a considerable conversation in which our whole party were very much interested, and the particulars of which I will now not detail. And I suspect that was Underground Railroad information, because then he says, "Suffice it to say for the present, to say that he preferred Canada to Virginia and left Loudoun in 1850. His name is Amos Norris. He lived at one time with Nathan Janney in Loudoun and married Amanda Mann, whose sister Betsy Lambert lived with thee, Samuel Janney, when he last heard from her. Amos is doing well, owns a little farm with comfortable buildings, and has a good carriage and pair of horses which are employed in conveying visitors to points of interest in the neighborhood. We found upon inquiry he was a thriving, respectable man, doing well in every way and a faithful subject of the Queen. He took us to see Daniel Dangerfield, alias Webster, in whose case Edward Hopper was employed when he was captured at Harrisburg and an attempt was made to return him to his master in Loudoun County. We found him living comfortably in a neat house with sufficient ground to raise his own provisions, and it was difficult to realize that the bright-eyed man before us was the same Daniel that Edward and myself saw handcuffed in one of our courtrooms in Philadelphia about 2 years before. The interview between Daniel and the company will not soon be forgotten by any of us. We were informed that about 200 fugitives live within 2 miles of the Falls of Niagara on the Canada side, and they are remarkable for their good conduct and thrift. They enjoy, of course, equal privileges with the whites, and there appeared to be no distinction, although there's lots of evidence that there was. And Canada, too, is working with that history. But anyway, he says his wife has sent many letters to her sister Betsy and can't find her, and so they ask for Samuel's help in reuniting them. And that's an example of those connections that span Virginia through Pennsylvania, through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, and beyond. And of course, we were talking April of 1859, October 16th, 1859 was the date of John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry. These are the 5 black members of the, I think there are 21 raiders, and one of them, Daniel Dangerfield Newby. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some relation. There were often naming patterns in black families in slavery and freedom. His wife was in Prince William. He was from Culpeper, and the letters that traveled back and forth were kind of along the same route that Nelson Talbot Gant would have used, and just shows the communications. And Osborne Perry Anderson, who Dangerfield Newby was killed there. Osborne Perry Anderson escaped thanks to one of William Goodrich's Reliance cars, and with the false bottom in it, and the networks protected him. Of the raid, the National Park Service on their site said it was treason, murder, and insurrection. John Brown's raid was also a turning point in American history, away from compromise and toward war. And James Miller McKim on the subject wrote that a virtuous war is better than a corrupt peace. Then Miller McKim's story isn't over, because he went to Harpers Ferry and with his wife Sarah, and they escorted Mary Brown to Harpers Ferry. They took her there, stayed with her through the execution, and then traveled to North Elba, New York, where John Brown's body was buried. And so, in closing here, I want to say that in emancipating himself, Daniel Dangerfield joined a community of activists. He could have been part of that community while he was still here. And we can guess, but we'll probably never know for sure, if Loudoun County agents assisted him there, or whether he helped others in Pennsylvania and beyond. But it seems clear to me that he wasn't just helped by that network, that he was a part of it. And together they were creating not just networks of support while they were fraying slavery where it existed, but they were modeling what Dr. Martin Luther King calls the beloved community. And I find it inspiring, and I hope you do too, and happy to answer questions. Rich?
My question is this. If you think of the fact that John Brown's first advance man, John Edwin Cook, is standing on Jefferson Rock the same time as this hearing is going on in Independence Hall, and you think of the symbolism of those things,
Yeah.
why isn't this story much known beyond a small circle attached to either Aldie Mill or to African American history in Loudoun County? I mean, you never read of it much beyond that. And it's sort of like our private story. How come with that kind of flashing symbolism and the involvement of McKim and Crucial Mott and any thoughts?
I think because it just hasn't gotten attention. I think the time now is ripe for that, but I don't know that I've ever given a talk about, this variety of activists, African American stories or otherwise. Why aren't they teaching this in the schools? Why isn't this more widely known? And I have to take some of the blame for it because I haven't done the publishing that I should have. I tried to write a book and have many drafts of chapters but every time I focus on a story, it just got bigger and bigger and more complicated and so many intertwinings. But I have been publishing essays one at a time in various places, but maybe I should try to bring them together somehow. And everybody, we need all your help. Lee Lawrence has done a great job with her website and blog, Nest of Abolitionists, and she's got some of the stories there along with primary sources, images of them. That's really helpful. And if you search on some of these people, her sites come up, and so that's really helpful. But yeah, and I am, this whole Independence Hall thing kind of blew me away. And it's something that they should know about, but I think it's the tendency to stay in your own little sphere. Yeah?
Deborah, I liked your quote about Lucretia Mott and saying she wouldn't spend a penny to buy its freedom, but do you know if they were prepared to purchase if the ruling had gone differently?
They probably would have, and I say that because in 1854, Anthony Burns, who was from Alexandria and a member of Leonard Grimes' church in Boston, he was apprehended, and there was an even bigger to-do about his hearing there. And he, though, was remanded into slavery, and there was a big hue and cry, and Leonard Grimes from Leesburg led the effort to raise the money for his purchase, and then traveled to Alexandria and made that, exchange and traveled back with Anthony Burns. So I suspect they would have, but they were increasingly resisting. There were people, even in some of these newspaper coverage, there was coverage of a woman who had gone to Philadelphia it was sort of their version of GoFundMe, trying to raise money to purchase her and her children. And people were increasingly saying no. the colonization movement. There, Thaddeus Herndon from Fauquier County near here, he said that he would free many people he held in slavery, but he couldn't afford to pay their passage to Liberia in this case. So he asked the Colonization Society, and that really threw the anti-slavery people into a fit, because what do? So a lot of them held their nose and gave them money, but they were increasingly resisting that. So in this case, I suspect they would have, but it was becoming the principle of the thing, and they were trying to find other ways. And yeah, there was I had a quote somewhere from George Nagel of Pennsylvania about the way, the networks that they were developing, and the public protests, and the advocating in the courts, the hiding people escaping, and assisted. It was just really a broad network of support that was becoming stronger all along.
Any other questions?
Deborah, do you know, sure, if there are any statistics in terms of how many people self-emancipated? I mean, has there ever been a number thrown out there? We know that the network went north, but it also went to Mexico, Cuba, it went to the Caribbean, and so even as I read, I can't make out, well, how many, maybe 1,000, 2,000?
Oh, it was well into the thousands. I think Manesha Sinha estimated some numbers. Unfortunately, numbers don't stick in my head, and it is really hard to estimate, and that has been a problem, and one reason why Underground Railroad research, has been a problem. But if you look at the U.S. colored troops, it's amazing how many of them were from the South, and many of them were self-emancipated and signed up in other areas. So that helps, and I'm glad that communities like Loudoun and Fauquier are doing the work to gather those numbers of how many U.S. colored troops were originally from Loudoun and other places. So, but I suspect the number was many thousands, just from what I've seen, and some people like William Still helped thousands, and William Wright in Maryland or Pennsylvania did similarly. So, and often too, you see the word chain migration has kind of gotten a bad name in politics, but you see these clusters of people like from Point of Rocks in Ithaca and Elmira, and from other in Boston, people from Leesburg area, some there, and then Ohio, there's a similar thing, the black communities there you can tie to, and well, John W. Jones, he had a sister come and live with him before the Civil War, and then when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, he invited his other sister and her grown children to come, and they did. They considered themselves free and able to travel there, and they settled there. So that's an example. In Clark County and Chambersburg, there's a whole cluster. So yeah, it was many people, and they often did keep communication over the long haul. And there was a lot of travel, and of course letters. John W. Jones, Wilbur Siebert had Jervis Langdon's daughter, Mark Twain's sister-in-law, interviewed him, and she said, "How did you communicate with people in the South?" And he said, "Oh, it was easy. We just send letters to someone in Canada, and then they would send them, to someone in Virginia or elsewhere in the South."
Other questions?
I have one, if I'm not. Okay, so I'm always curious about Canadians because of the descendants of those who live there now and were part of the Underground Railroad. And things that I'm reading, and it's not even just Canada, it's also Ohio, even the northern cities, northern states. They weren't happy about these self-emancipated black people coming into their territories. What's your feeling in reading? Because every time I read something, I hear, oh, they crossed the river to Ohio, but the white citizens there they were there with bats to beat them back into the water. So a lot of the narratives sound simple, but they're extremely complicated and extremely dangerous.
That's right.
I mean, there were a lot of lives lost.
I hadn't heard about the baseball bats, but I do know that they did face discrimination there as everywhere, and that the people, there's a range of welcome, and that they did need that organization there on the other side. And there's plenty of testimony from people who lived there in personal letters as well as published books that they feel so relieved there and that they wouldn't want to come back. Some people did come back, and there were people from Frederick, Maryland in Elmira, New York, and actually there was a Daniel Webster living with John W. Jones in 1855 and then later on, and I've corresponded with my contact in Elmira about, is this Daniel Dangerfield? And it doesn't seem like it, but it could have if he was traveling, and then he was in Canada for a while and then back, and there was someone from Frederick forging freedom papers that went to Canada, married there, but then they came back, and then some came and joined the U.S. colored troops to fight for greater freedom here. So you did have a range, and of course the discrimination continued, and something they're contending with along with the indigenous First Nation kind of prejudice. So, and with the graveyards, similar to here, graveyards that haven't been respected, and but they have been collecting their history too. And at conferences, I've met some of the Canadian descendants of enslaved people from the United States, and they're looking to learn more and to make connections with people here about their ancestors. So, but yeah, the work is not done, as we all know.
Hiram Rutherford, did he ever get anywhere near Loudoun County? I think you mentioned if you come from Philadelphia or from Pennsylvania.
Yes, I don't know if he did or not. I'm not sure. I've seen different things about whether he was how he was related to William, and there was William Sr., and the three listed there were his sons. But the Dr. William Rutherford and Hiram together went to Illinois, where they helped people there who had escaped slavery, or the people in the black community there. And in one case, they advocated for the man on the other side hired Abraham Lincoln as an attorney to advocate, for. So yeah, these stories are.
Well, the reason I ask is that Nathan Minor, free black man born about 1790 in Waterford, had sons named Hiram, Rutherford, Samuel, and William.
Oh my
So I'm
goodness.
wondering, how on earth would he have?
That's beautiful, Bronwyn. That, it's highly likely, because we know there was activity in Waterford, and the river is right there, and going up, you follow the mountains, that's what people did, and the Susquehanna River up there,
Was Rutherford publicized much? I mean, Loudoun County was certainly reading news from around the Atlantic. Would Rutherford have been publicized much?
I don't think so. I think it was more, I couldn't find pictures of any of them, except for Hiram. But they did allude to many Rutherfords in that area, and it was a very concerted effort to assist people. So
Well, thank you.
that,
I'll look through it.
yeah.
One last question.
Deborah, I think you mentioned that at least 3 of the freedom seekers you talked about were in around the same area of Loudoun and south of Oakland. So what area was that? I mean, is it a number of plantations or where they lived? And you said it was around the same area, so it was.
Yeah, so you have Oatlands, and then there's, if you keep going south on 15, is it called Barclay, that fancy, a nice, subdivision there. And, the Black History Committee was contacted when they were developing, and we knew it was French Simpson Estate, and we went to see a log structure there that was like the only remaining building of any note or age. And then John W. Jones was Lynn helped me out there.
Well, he was
In
an
fact,
Aldie
Lynn-
family, which is
Yeah,
Mount
the
Middleton
Aldie
on Evergreen
family.
Mill Road.
Mount
Mount Middleton,
Middleton.
it's near Ryan Road, if you know
Yeah.
that area, so.
Yeah, the old Carolina Road, when before 15 was widened, it's along there. Leonard Grimes was from the Leesburg area, and the people he helped escape, Patty and her 6 children, they were owned by someone named Mead, M-E-A-D, who was, and I think there's a road with their name south of Leesburg. I haven't gone to where they were from, but I figured it was somewhere around that road. Rich?
Is it possible that there was a free African-American settlement, more or less up Watson Road, or maybe
There-
slightly least in the hilly area there? And was it the possibility that the concentration of free African-Americans was making it at least possible to have an initial spot to jump off from that would not be quite as available in other places?
That's possible. A lot of times, hilly areas that aren't so good for farming was where free blacks could buy less expensive land, or people could be squatters in those areas too, and they were more hidden from view for people traveling through. There's what used to be called Negro Hill,
Yeah, that's what I'm
further
referencing.
east, and there's one near you, Britain. There's a hill there, and Coney Morrison writes about that in the book of these communities, looking down on the white, villages from this nice view. So, yeah, it is interesting, that cluster of notable people from that area, but it's hard to say.
Of course, if you think about it, the fact that we don't know is one of the coolest things about this.
Yeah.
Because the fact that we don't know means that it worked.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
that's true.
That's right.
Yeah, in Point of Rocks, there were a number of people that escaped from there. And there was someone in Binghamton, New York from there, but a number in Ithaca. And there was one man that, after the war, he wanted to come get his mother. Jackson was his last name. And he didn't have the money, and he pleaded with his employer to, let him go and help with that, and he did. The man said, "You'll never find her," but he found her, and he took her back. And she settled there in Ithaca also. So yeah, that whole Carolina Road is a lot from there. And then Wanzer, Frank Wanzer, and John Wanzer was the blacksmith in Middletown and Middleburg, and and Marshalls. There was a whole large group.
We could go on and on.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah. I want to very quickly say, if you have a few minutes before you get back in your cars, at this end of our mill building, we have an interpretive sign about Daniel Dangerfield. Several of you here helped me to write that, not least of whom was Deborah, Donna, Lori, Rich, who am I forgetting? Anyway, it took a while to write. That's right, Phil. It took a while to write a short little sign. It's so hard to write a short sign, and to make sure you get it right, and you don't put one wrong thing on it. It was so difficult, but we did it, and we unveiled it back earlier this year. And so my thanks to those of you who helped with that, and it is out there. Also, one of our partners today, Gary Clemens, Clerk of Court, Historic Records Division. Eric Larson's here, Lori Kimball. I know you all pulled together some information that's on that back table. Is there anything either of you wanted to add to this story? Anything you wanted to point out or mention?
I encourage you to pick up a handout. We have a few more left on what we have about Dangerfield in our records, which isn't really much at all. But Lori put a nice presentation together in this packet. Gives you some more information, especially on the French Simpson will and family. And then also, if you don't get a copy of it, you can go to our website. We posted that up on our
Great.
website as
Thank
well.
Lori was emailing me about the research and all the rabbit holes that all of you researchers go down, and oh my gosh, is it complicated, but absolutely wonderful. I mentioned that you all were partners. We also had the Black History Committee. The Thomas Welsh Library was one of our partners today, and also Loudoun County Public Libraries. And Jeremy's back here filming for us, so this has been filmed, which is great for posterity. The library system's been a wonderful sponsor of many of our programs. Just thank you so much for coming all this way and for sharing your information. There's so much this lady has in her head. It's absolutely incredible. There's so much more. I think we need a really good movie out of this story. I'm thinking of a few wonderful actors who could take on these roles. In any case, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time. I have a favorite newscaster on NBC, Jose, what's his name? Jose.
He's your favorite.
Jose. He's on Saturday evenings on NBC. He's on MSNBC, and I love his sign off, which is so
Is it
sincerely.
Ballard?
Jose
Ballard?
Ballard, somebody. He used to be on Telemundo, and now he's anyway. His sign off is always so genuine, and I actually looked at it last night on Google, and when I typed it in, it's all over Google. It's like I'm not the only one who thinks it's cool, but he always says very sincerely at the end of every of his newscast, thank you for the privilege of your time. And I love that, and so I'm stealing it. Thank you for the privilege of your time. Thank you, Deborah. And what a wonderful story. We have a lot, we owe a lot to Daniel Dangerfield, and we hope we can continue to tell his story. So thank you all. Appreciate it.